Jordan hosts diplomats for talks as Syria sees renewed international engagement. Egypt's President Sisi discusses Gaza ceasefire, Lebanon stability, and Syria with US officials. And South Korea's impeached President Yoon vows perseverance, while the Prime Minister assumes acting president roles amid power suspension. Good afternoon, it's 4 o'clock and it's Cairo local time, and you're now watching Qnews. We begin with today's latest bulletin with the latest developments in Syria. Jordan has hosted the US, EU and Turkish and Arab diplomats for high-level talks on Syria. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on a regional Syria-focused tour, also joined the Aqaba meeting. Meanwhile, Turkey will reopen its embassy in Damascus, which has been closed since 2012, amid calls from Ankara for Assad to step down. A Qatari diplomat stated that a delegation from the Gulf Emirate would visit Syria on Sunday to meet with transitional government officials and discuss aid and the reopening of the embassy. A massive explosion has illuminated the Damascus skyline, followed by another powerful blast, marking a dramatic turn of events in the city. The blast occurred shortly after armed groups seized control, effectively ending Bashar al-Assad's rule. This marks Damascus's first Friday under the new leadership. The cause of the explosion remains unknown, with no confirmation of its origin or further details provided at this time. US CENTCOM Commander General Michael Kurilla has visited Israel for discussions with Israeli military officials on Syria and other regional developments. Kurilla met with Israeli military chief Herzi Halevi and the Defense Minister Israel Katz, stressing the need for coordination following the end of Assad's 50-year rule. His regional tour included visits to Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, where he visited and observed Israel's partial withdrawal under a fragile ceasefire. Meanwhile, Israel's Gaza campaign continues amid international criticism and accusations of genocide. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has told the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, that he wanted the UN to play a critical role in delivering assistance to Syria. Pedersen stated that he wanted to ensure Syria does not collapse, that humanitarian aid flows in quickly, and that the UN supports a credible and inclusive political process. Meanwhile, Blinken is touring the Middle East to establish a united front with Arab and Turkish allies on a set of principles that Washington hopes will guide Syria's political transition, including inclusivity and respect for minorities.
Compare notes with the envoy and to again think through how we can support the Syrian people in this time of both opportunity but also a real challenge, and to do so in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 2254 when it comes to the provision of assistance to the protection of minorities.
The UN Special Envoy to Syria, Geir Pedersen, has called for a genuine political process to unite all Syrian factions. He further emphasized the need to preserve state institutions and expedite the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. Meanwhile, Syrian state television announced the collapse of the Assad regime. broadcasting a red screen with the message declaring the victory of the Great Syrian Revolution. This development follows 11 days of intense clashes between Syrian factions and the military. State TV urged citizens to protect public property and comply with interim oversight led by the Prime Minister. Increased activity has been reported at Russia's Hmeimim airbase and in the Latakia in Syria region, with cargo planes and helicopters landing frequently. A Russian cargo plane departed for Libya following the overthrow of the president. A Syrian official confirms that more departures are expected soon. Earlier, Russia granted Assad asylum, facilitating his escape from Damascus. A Syria war monitor has reported that Israel launched strikes early today, targeting military sites in Damascus and its countryside. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that strikes in northern Damascus destroyed a scientific institute, military facilities, and a military airport. They also targeted Scud missile warehouses, launchers, and rocket depots in the Kalamun area, including tunnels beneath the mountain. The United Nations reports that 1.1 million people have been displaced across Syria since fighting intensified on November 27th. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has reported most of the displaced are women and children. Nearly 640,000 have fled Aleppo, 334,000 left Idlib, and 136,000 were displaced from Hama. Meanwhile, 438,000 sought refuge in Idlib, 170,000 in Hama, and 123,000 in rural Damascus. Over 400,000 are in shelters in northeastern Syria, receiving food and aid. Almost 700,000 people across Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, and Hama have received food assistance since the escalation. Israeli occupation forces have intensified their aggression in Syria, seizing key military sites and launching airstrikes as regional tensions continue to rise.
The Israeli occupation forces have intensified aggressions in Syria, targeting key military and strategic sites as regional tensions escalate. Over the past 48 hours, the Israeli military has seized control of the Syrian side of Jabal al-Khalil, aiming to establish a security zone along the border. This significant territorial expansion is justified by Israel as a preventive measure against perceived threats from Iranian forces and Hezbollah operating in the region. Concurrently, Israeli airstrikes reportedly targeted a Syrian chemical weapons facility. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has stated that these actions are intended solely to ensure Israeli security, denying any intent to interfere in Syria's internal affairs. However, the escalation follows Israeli accusations that Syria is being used as a conduit for Iranian arms transfers to Hezbollah in Lebanon. The United Nations has voiced concerns over these developments, warning that Israel's actions could violate existing agreements, establishing a demilitarized buffer zone in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. Despite this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reaffirmed the country's resolve to neutralize any threats, emphasizing its readiness to take all necessary measures. International responses have been muted. While the United States continues to support Israel's broader regional strategy, Russia has urged restraint without committing to direct intervention. This latest escalation in Syria unfolds amid an already volatile regional backdrop. The ongoing war in Gaza, combined with daily Israeli violations threatening a fragile ceasefire in southern Lebanon, further complicates the region's dynamics. The situation in Syria adds yet another dimension to the intensifying conflict.
Now, for more analysis, we move to Selma in the newsroom. Selma.
Thank you so much, Mark. And for further analysis on the current situation in Syria, we're joined from Cairo by the head of the Arab and Regional Studies Unit at Al Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies, Dr. Muhammad Aiz Al-Arab. Dr. Muhammad, welcome to Q News. Thank you so much for joining us. First off, what is your assessment of Secretary Antony Blinken's recent statements regarding Syria, and how might they shape U.S. policy in the region?
Is trying to carry out a role in Syria in the post-Bashar al-Assad phase on different fronts. The first front is maintaining stability in Syria, because the lack of stability in Syria means the extension of this instability to the neighboring countries and the entire region, especially for Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and the other countries in the region. The second consideration is that the United States of America is afraid of and concerned with the return of the major threat source, with a number of terrorist groups, ISIS, who are going to be able to come back and to return to some of the countries. And we've seen ISIS taking control of different regions in Syria and Iraq for a decade. The third consideration is that the United States of America is concerned with the chemical weapons prevailing once again that was controlled by the Syrian regime, and the transition of these weapons to some dangerous parties in the regions, and I mean the extremist groups and the terrorist groups, which is going to pose a threat to the stability of the region. The fourth consideration is that the United States of America is also concerned with the extension of this instability to Israel, as Israel is now able to take control over some regions in Syria, and also such as the Al-Qunaytara and the Golan and the Sheikh Mountain. And this represents a major threat. The statements of Antony Blinken did not indicate the Israeli practices, the illegal practices of Israel in Syria.
Now, sir, regarding humanitarian aid, how effective have United Nations humanitarian aid efforts been in addressing Syria's urgent needs, and what challenges remain?
So far, we haven't seen the international community taking effective steps, whether international powers, the international organizations, the NGOs, with regard to directing humanitarian assistance to Syria. And maybe the meeting held in Amman today is an attempt to shed some light on this point, to establish a comprehensive political process for the transmission of power from the old regime to the new regime in Syria. The challenge facing the access of humanitarian aid to Syria are too many. The first challenge is related to the lack of knowledge of we don't know that how much of a human assistance is needed in Syria. We're not aware of the volume of needed assistance. The second challenge that there are some regions that are facing different set of conflicts, which is the case in Sudan and Libya and Yemen. They all require humanitarian aid and assistance, which requires a fair distribution to different regions, and that affects the Syrian people and prevents the just access to humanitarian aid. There is also a challenge regarding some terrorist groups take control over these humanitarian aids via their armed groups.
Now, sir, delving into Syria's political developments, what are the main challenges facing those who now hold power in Syria, and how can they navigate the post-Assad era?
There are numerous challenges that facing stability in Syria, including the different armed factions controlling the inner affairs, the internal affairs in Syria, which is clouding the next period of time, and these factions are hindering reaching a clear vision for the next period. And we don't know the agendas of these different factions, which is affecting the stability of Syria. Being concerned with political gains is now controlling the scene in Syria. Another consideration regarding the differences taking place between different factions and the regional powers supporting each faction, especially Turkey, is a huge challenge during the upcoming period. There is also a challenge with regard to the different agendas in Syria, which is the national reconciliation, the economy, the challenge of facing and combating the spread of weapons, as the different groups now possess weapons.
Now, sir, in light of Antony Blinken's 12th visit to the Middle East region, what expectations should the region have from Secretary Blinken's current tour, and how might it influence the situation in Syria?
Please repeat the question.
Yes, in light of Antony Blinken's 12th tour to the Middle East regions, what should we expect this time from this visit? What would make it different, and how would it impact the situation in Syria?
Blinken is trying to carry out different roles to support the stability in Syria. The first point is an attempt to achieve stability in the country by defining the role of the United States of America and some of the regional power concerned with the stability of Syria, including Turkey and Arab states, Arab neighboring states like Iraq and Jordan. The U.S. attention also extends to proving the seriousness of the United States of America to combat transborder terrorism, which is a threat to the entire region, including the return of ISIS again. There is also
Now, sir, looking at the wider picture, what strategies can the international community adopt to ensure effective humanitarian and political support for Syria?
So far, we have not seen any strategies adopted by the international community to give access to humanitarian aid in Syria. And we probably will see some of these strategies during the upcoming period, because till this moment the Syrian people has not faced a severe crisis such as the crisis faced by peoples in different other regions that we see in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq and Sudan. The second point, probably during the upcoming period, we're going to witness the strategies if the condition deteriorates further in Syria.
That was the head of the Arab and Regional Studies Unit at Al Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies, Dr. Muhammad Azz Al Arab. Thank you so much for your insights. And now we're going to move back to Mark in the studio.
Thank you very much, Salma. Now moving next to the situation in Gaza. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has discussed efforts with visiting U.S. officials to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and a detainee deal in the Palestinian enclave. Ambassador Mohammed el-Shanawi stated that the meeting also addressed preserving the ceasefire in Lebanon as a foundation for regional calm and reviewed developments in Syria. The officials who met with President el-Sisi in Cairo included U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the U.S. Middle East envoy Brett McGurk. Several citizens have been killed and injured in the ongoing bombings of multiple areas in the Gaza Strip by occupation forces. In Jabalia, 4 members of the Sadala family were killed in an Israeli airstrike on their home, and 2 others were injured in a raid on a house in Jabalia al-Balad. 2 people were killed and others injured in an attack on the Yafa school, northeast of Gaza City. A woman was also killed in an airstrike on a displaced person shelter south of Khan Yunis. The Israeli occupation army has stated that 2 projectiles were intercepted after being launched from central Gaza earlier. The army announced that rocket sirens had sounded in communities surrounding the Gaza Strip. Al-Quds brigades claimed responsibility for a rocket attack from Gaza, which the group said it had launched. South Korea's impeached president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has vowed to fight on, promising to do his best for the country until the very end. Yoon's impeachment came today after the opposition-led parliament held a second vote, following his controversial attempt last week to impose martial law. The move, which shocked the nation and divided his own party, led to his suspension from presidential duties. Under the constitution, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo appointed Yoon and will serve as acting president while Yoon remains in office, albeit with his powers temporarily stripped.
저는 결코 포기하지 않겠습니다.
And that's almost all we have time for right now, but let's have a recap of the headlines. Jordan hosts diplomats for talks as Syria sees renewed international engagement. Egypt's President Sisi discusses Gaza ceasefire, Lebanon stability, and Syria with US officials. And impeached South Korean President Yoon vows to fight on after the suspension of powers. And that's all for now, but don't forget to follow us, Qnews at Qnews EGY on all our socials. Thanks for watching.